Hello and welcome to episode 2 with Dr. Cecile Boganin, who describes various treatment approaches to structural dissociation, specifically around eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, as well as things like IFS, internal family systems therapy, and other types of therapies that access parts within a person's personality, so identifying various parts that are acting in unison and independently of one another, and being able to utilize exposure to these parts in the therapeutic process. So I hope you enjoy today's episode, which is a follow-on from the first episode. If you haven't listened to that one and you want to get a better understanding of structural dissociation and complex post-traumatic stress, you might want to go and listen to that one and then come back here. But at the same time, have a listen to the various treatment approaches and take it from there. I hope you enjoy.
The International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, ISSTD, has a three-phase treatment approach. The first phase is about stabilization and symptom reduction. The second phase is working on the trauma and trying to integrate the trauma into the person's sense of self. And the third phase is rehabilitation and parts integration. So very much the first phase, just before you've asked me, do you tell the clients about how the brain worked during trauma and what has happened to them? Yes, absolutely. So much psychoeducation is necessary at the beginning for the client to understand what has happened and what's going on with them. Why do they suddenly, impulsively leave a current engagement to go out partying because there is this urge to do so? Why is the client so frightened when they go, shopping or cooking or whatever? What's happening with this switch? So much psychoeducation at the beginning in relation to that structural dissociation and how it has impacted not only their sense of self, but how they approach the environment and how they react to the environment. So that then they can understand why they should apply those emotion regulation techniques or distress tolerance technique. It's because a part of their memory network, a part of their brain has been triggered, and now they feel unsafe. They know that they are safe, but it feels unsafe. So let's apply this technique now that you understand what's going on and how it's working within your own brain and body.
Okay, so there's a whole specific approach, and this one can encapsulate a plethora of different therapeutic approaches to them, as long as we're doing it in a stepwise manner. Do you have thoughts on, or does the gonna have to repeat it, the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation?
For the study of trauma and dissociation.
Yes. And do they have guidelines that have been put forward about the types of treatment approaches, or do you have your own senses?
Yeah, no, I definitely. So they recommend, anything that is a trauma-based therapy, in particular EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, because this therapy, encompasses a lot of other therapies, like somatic experiencing at the beginning to help the body ground themselves in relation to the present, but also during EMDR, you can use a lot of somatic techniques to integrate parts of the memories and how the body reacted so that it can become integrated into the person's sense of self, but also their autobiographical memory, the narrative memory, rather than remaining a specific vivid memory. So yes, and ego state therapy is very much mentioned in the ISTD and used in EMDR when we have hearts.
Let's repeat that one. You cut out a little bit. Ego state therapy.
Yes.
Okay. Before we get into that one, do you mind describing for our listeners who aren't aware of EMDR or ego state therapy what these encompass?
Mm-hmm. So EMDR is the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, where, in brief, essentially we ask the client to think back about the memory of a traumatic event that they've experienced, and you want to kind of map that memory in terms of what is it that they see, and when they see the memory, what is it that they think about themselves. So, I'm unlovable, or I'm unsafe. Well, what is it that they would like to think about themselves instead if EMDR worked? And you take a validity of that positive cognition. So before the reprocessing happens, the client might say, I would like to believe I'm lovable, but as I look at this image, it's 1 out of 7. It's totally untrue. And you also ask the person, okay, so when you think about that memory and you tell yourself, I'm unlovable or I'm unsafe, what is it that you notice in your body? So you kind of activate that memory network. So you ask the client to hold these 3 elements whilst, and to think about that, and then they follow your finger, right, left, that's called bilateral stimulation, or you can ask them to tap each side of their body so that it stimulates the right hemisphere of the brain, left hemisphere of the brain, to help information become processed and then integrated. So right hemisphere of the brain, where the traumatic memory is thought to be held, to the left side of the brain, which is more that executive functioning part, that rational, that logic, that factual knowledge, and it's moved across. And then hopefully after several bilateral stimulation, it comes to an end where nothing new comes up. And then you ask the client to think back at the memory. And then what they will tell you is that now there is this really distance between themselves and the memory, or the quality of the image is different. It's more in pixels, or it might not have as much color. So the memory has been integrated. And when you tell them, all right, so can you think now about that positive statement? How true does that feel? And now it feels like 6 out of 7. All right, let's implement that positive cognition now. So this is EMDR in brief, in relation to a primary structural dissociation or acute stress disorder or PTSD.
And you would need to go through each of the memories that a person experiences. You can't do a bunch of memories at the same time. Is that fair to say?
So again, when it's primary structural dissociation or acute stress disorder or PTSD, you start with the memory of the recent traumatic event, and you ask the client to think of to hold the cognition, I am unsafe, I'm unlovable, and the emotion that they feel in their body, and float back to see if there is an earlier memory with similar content. So you tap into that memory network, and you want to get to the earliest memory and the worst memory. And so you start with the earliest, and when the client thinks about that childhood memory where they, let's say if we go with lovable, where they were bullied at school, for instance, and they went to the teacher and the teacher didn't help. So you go with the first memory of the bully or of the teacher who didn't help. And then when you do the bilateral stimulation, now you're inside almost a memory network. And the bilateral stimulation will activate that material, that content. And so it might go through other memories. In fact, most of the time you get clients telling you, oh yeah, now I remember when my brother did this to me, or when my sister did this to me. Good, notice that, go with that. And this way you kind of also work on desensitizing additional content, stressful content within that memory network.
Okay.
And then next session you reevaluate, the SAD, so the how distress, the subject unit of distress that the person feels in relation to the memory and the VOC, so the validity of the cognition, the positive cognition. And if it still remain really, really low, so 0 or 1 out of 10 in terms of the SAD, the distress, and hopefully still remain the 7 out of 7 in relation to the VOC, then you move to the worst memory. The same
Sounds like quite the process. Is it common that, and when I say quite the process, it seems, having practiced these types of therapies, it seems quite intuitive when you're doing it. But there are EMDR from memory is an 8-phase treatment approach, which a lot of those phases can happen in a single session in terms of the processing and the evaluating and the reintegrating positive cognitions and all that sort of stuff. But it can be, as far as I'm aware now, I may have just jumped in that very briefly for time purposes, but I'm sure we can have an entire 2-hour episode on EMDR, which we might actually do at one point in the future. But I'm very interested in these types of therapies because you mentioned it before. They encompass what's called dual awareness, and where you put it so eloquently, you keep one foot in the present and another foot in the past. And it is within this dual awareness that a lot of that change could happen. And in fact, this is what we see when we investigate what's actually going on in the human brain, and understanding the brain's timekeeper, various structures within the medial prefrontal cortex, various structures within the limbic region, and how these are activated when we re-experience a trauma, and then when we've processed, quote unquote, that trauma, and how these tend to relate to the person afterwards. EMDR, I think, is a beautiful example, and developed by Francine Shapiro, who regrettably, she passed away in 2019. So she was, she was with us relatively recently. But it was very interesting how she first became aware of this approach, where she was walking down a pathway in a local park, and she was quite stressed out about what subject that she was going to choose for her graduate studies. She hadn't settled on a subject at that point, and she was like, okay, what am I going to study? And her eyes went from the tree line on the right to the tree line on the left, and then she noticed that as she darted from right to left to right to left, her emotions started to decrease. And she's like, oh, this is interesting. Let's study this. And then she studied that one, and it became EMDR. That's a great summary that you provided, Cecile. Are there other, you mentioned ego state therapy, and presumably there are a lot more. You've mentioned IFS and Schema and a few other, though you did mention Schema wasn't necessarily the best approach in these situations. But you might want to clarify what you want to clarify around different methodologies. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So just to go back a little bit to EMDR, then in those 8 phases, right, that are assessment and stabilization, and then you assess the past memory. So the client might have come to you to resolve, a car accident that they've experienced. But you can't process the car accident memory, because if you do that, then at some point it's going to loop, because in that memory network, you're going to have an earlier memory that says, I'm not safe, or hang on, but this happened to me, and we're not addressing this. So that's why you need to go there first, so that then you can address what the client actually came to see you for. And then you can, you also have to do the current triggers. So cars, parks, anything, related to is related to the accident. And then you go future. Okay, so now about helping the person decrease the level of stress, anxiety, fear that they might have about driving. So yes, it is a comprehensive, complex approach, but it works fast. It works really well. It's a bit different when obviously there is childhood trauma, because now we have, like we said before, dissociated memory network that have acquired their own life stories. And so now you need to work with those parts of the sense of self. You can still definitely apply EMDR, but it's going to be an adaptation of it until the client is able to then go through the standard protocol.
You mentioned ego state therapy. Is this another therapy that you use?
Yes. So, and I'm just going to go back to something you said before in terms of schema therapy. So you said schema therapy is not appropriate in relation to this presentation. And I think it goes again back to the fact that when you put the client in a part and you ask them to feel and be and understand and the thinking of that part, you kind of lose the dual attention processing because you put the client back into the part. When you switch chairs to go back to this healthy adult part or the sense of self, then they go back. So it's a little bit, there is that dual attention processing, but not as it happens when they think back off or when they explore that part, which again,
it needs to be in parallel with the accessing the past. Has to be done in parallel with the present, rather than let's go to the past, now let's go back to the present now. Okay, that's important to consider. And that's where eye movements or bilateral stimulation or dual awareness, however you want to term it, keeps the person in the present while at the same time accessing a past event. And you see the same thing with various tapping therapies, things like emotion freedom technique or radical exposure tapping, which smells like EMDR in the sense of dual awareness therapies, where we're accessing a past experience and then you're tapping various parts of your body, though it is not bilateral stimulation. It is a dual awareness protocol while reciting various elements of these memories, and people tend to have the same results.
Interesting.
Yeah. Interesting. We can.
I'm not aware of the tapping therapy. I know you are, but I'm not aware of this therapy.
Yeah, I published a paper back in 2019 describing, it's a phenomenological case study. So for any listeners who want to look into what tapping therapies look like, that would be a good paper to start with, and I can link that to the episode. But basically it just goes through what I did with a single individual and described their pre and post experiences. But yeah, there are many different ways of processing trauma that utilize dual awareness. When it comes to ego state therapy, or perhaps another therapy that comes to mind, what are your main considerations there?
So ego state therapy is where you obviously work with the parts, and I like to do it the IFS way, where you talk through the host, right? Talk through the apparently normal part, where you again hold that dual attention processing, where they're able to remain in the present, because what you want is co-consciousness across parts. If you suddenly talk with a young part, you've lost co-consciousness. So you want to work through the host or the apparently normal part, or the part who takes care of business, so that they are able to communicate and explore that sense of self. And the structural dissociation explains that you want to work really on a lot of things, but three things in particular, which is personification. To make the part who is stuck in the past, who is fixated in those traumatic childhood events, that now they're actually part of an adult body. And that means that they can really protect themselves and survive, and they have survived, and they can continue to do so and protect themselves. You also want to work on presentification, which is bring that part into present, to not only realize that they are part of this adult body, but now the perpetrator is dead. Now they actually have a really successful career or loving people around them. And so all about the reality of the present, because PTSD, complex PTSD, is a trauma of non-realization. So you want to help the part to realize that now, the present and personification. And you also want to work on collaboration, because those parts, again, were there with a specific goal to protect the individual. But when they come out, they still try to protect the person the same way they used to do so. So if, for instance, self-harm was a way to cope with abuse or intense emotion or lack of emotion because there was too much dissociation or numbing, that was great and now worked at the time back then. But when you come out and you still do that, it doesn't work anymore. And in fact, it impacts on the person. So that's one part. But also if you have a lot of other parts and you work with a lot of different parts at the time, you can explain to them, so you try to do this, and you try to help this way, and you try to protect this way, and you try to help this way. That creates chaos. Can we try and all work together? How can we do that? Obviously, that's at a later stage of the treatment, but that is also one of the things that you want to do. And in fact, I've found that with young adults, it's not so much at a later part of the treatment. You can do that in that phase one of symptom reduction and stabilization.
It makes sense with young adults because would they have more access to these younger parts or quicker recall compared to someone who's in later life or who's more or an adult or an elderly person?
The sense of self is less rigid.
That's actually that's another point. Actually, I didn't think about the rigidity of that. I thought more about accessing different parts, but there's obviously the rigidity element there. The older you are, the more likely it is that you would have developed a sense of who you are or who you think you are, and yeah, that would be less amenable to change or challenge.
Yes, that, and also if the part who takes care of business is trying so hard to avoid, those traumatized or emotional parts, the more they do it all the time, it becomes classically conditioned, and it's almost like a reflex where it becomes so much harder to remain exploring a part because we have dissociation that keeps popping up.
And this is accessed through IFS informed therapies amongst other type therapies, or what's your sense of how to access these varying parts by, for example, imaginative or dual awareness, imaginative dual awareness, if you could term that?
So yes, it is similar to IFS, where again you talk through the host. IFS is the goal of IFS is slightly different, where it's more about healing and protecting the parts and going back with the adult self into the past and being able to support, you know, and meet the needs of the younger parts back then. But with this theory of the structural dissociation, what you really are trying to do is help those and the personality structure to become ready for EMDR and working on the trauma memories.
Okay. All right. So it's almost in the preparation phase of trauma treatment that you'd be doing that.
And you want to work with the part so that they can you know, be on the same goal with you of I'm going to help work on the memories so that I won't have so much negative or distressing energy so that the host can cope and function better. Because after all, my job is to help the host.
This is so interesting. The way that you describe the host brings to me almost a parasitic relationship between what's going on internally. This parasitic trauma that eats away at a person, and the therapy is involved with trying to help a person excise that parasite, but perhaps not. It's just that my brain's imagining some pretty interesting stuff as you discuss this.
Yeah, I understand. Yes. There's the host that takes care of business and the parts that are, again, trauma focused.
Yes, yeah. We've been going for quite a long time. How do you feel about describing or summarizing any other points of discussion that you feel are required to understand in terms of treatment, in terms of addressing this sort of stuff, before we bring it to a close?
So lots and lots and lots of psychoeducation so that not only you understand, but the client can also understand what is it that we're doing in treatment? Why are we talking to this spouse that I have repressed, oppressed, and I don't like? Why do I need to apply those weird somatic strategies that you're asking me to do? So yes, a lot of psychoeducations for an understanding. And the client's parts are, although they might be scary, although they might be mean, although they might condemn, call for the person to commit suicide. And of course, you want to make sure that the client is able to manage their distress, the host partner able to manage the distress, and then they have a safety plan. But those parts essentially came to give the child some type of relief or a way to think their way out of the trauma, some type of control. So there are no bad parts. Even the scariest one, there are no bad parts.
That's an interesting one. I think that's the title of a book by Richard Schwartz. There are no bad parts. Yeah, I've got that on my reading list. I haven't yet read it, but yeah, I've got access to it. That might be the next thing I look into.
Yes,
that's it's a beautiful topic to begin to close on, and I want to ask you, Cecile, is there anything that you think is very important that we haven't covered in the context of today's show, and something you'd want to expand a little bit more on, maybe some misconceptions about anything you've spoken about so far, or anything else?
I think we've covered quite a lot.
Yeah, I've got to have you on board again in the future at some point to go into these a little bit deeper, because I would say we'd need a lot more than 2 hours to go into this these therapeutic interventions and taken it from there pretty much. But if there's nothing else, where could people find you, Cecile? Where are you located? And if someone wants to reach out to you and get in touch and the rest of that, can you give our audience a bit of a rundown on where you're at?
Sure. So I am based in the southeastern suburb of Melbourne, in Malvern. And yes, I give supervision on, working with complex presentation. And you can find me on the website of alliedpsychologygroup.com.au.
Yeah, alliedpsychologygroup.com.au. Everyone, go into that website. You get to hear a little bit more about Cecile and about the other clinicians that are available there, and pepper her with questions if that's something that you'd like to do. But it's definitely been a really, really interesting and exciting process to touch into something that I had not much exposure to prior to this, which was structural dissociation and how to move forward into it. So thank you so much for coming on board and discussing all that you know. You've been very generous with your time, Cecile, and so I do appreciate that.
Thanks, Emil. Thanks for having me.